A forum now on U.S. relations with the Islamic world. A panel of Middle East scholars and policy analysts take part in the discussion, hosted by the World Affairs Council. John Donovan of ABC News Nightline moderates the hour and 40-minute event.
I think that works. Okay. All right, and then you can take this after I do the little short opening. Okay. Welcome. Is this on? No. Is it on? Welcome. We're trying to stick to a strict schedule this evening. And you can't hear over here? Is it on? Okay, we're trying to stick to a strict schedule this evening. Welcome on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C. We're happy to have you all here. The World Affairs Council is a non-profit, nonpartisan organization that's dedicated to educating the public and students on critical international issues facing our country and our world. And this is our first maiden effort to bring programming out to Bethesda. And the response has been very strong, and we're very happy to have you. We're very proud to have our co-sponsors this evening that have done this program with us. The League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, and Nancy Soreng is here, President. And Ambassador Bruce Langen, the President of the American Academy of Diplomacy, is also with us. And these are our co-sponsors for tonight's event. We're also very pleased to have a distinguished panel of experts here tonight to discuss what we believe is a very important topic, a sensitive and sometimes controversial topic, but one that you see in your papers every day. And we are doing a series on beginning the dialogue, and this is one part of that series. Our moderator today is John Donovan of ABC News. He's been with ABC News for over 2 decades. He's with Nightline News now. He was their chief White House correspondent, chief Moscow correspondent, Amman bureau chief, Jerusalem correspondent, and correspondent for the ABC News magazine Turning Point. I'm going to turn the show over to him, and he will give you the guidelines for the evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and it's wonderful to see so many people come out on what's turning into a rainy night, on the night of the debate. And Katherine and I have made an arrangement in which we promise to have everybody out of here in time to be home for the debate, so you don't need to get restless. We're going to be watching the clock. Our topic tonight focuses on the relationship of the United States to Islam, and more particularly the sense that we as Americans have about Islam. In thinking about this, the one thing that kept coming back to my mind was something that happened with my wife, who is an Israeli. I did not meet her when I was covering Israel, but many years later. And she is a physician here in Washington. She speaks perfect English. She was raised in Israel, a democracy. We had a whirlwind romance, all too brief. We barely knew each other when we got married. But at the 1 month to go point before we got married, she kind of clicked to the fact that I'm a Catholic. And she kind of clicked to the fact that she had no idea what that was. And she was living in London at that point, and I was living in New York. And we were having a transatlantic phone conversation. And she said, John, I bought this book called What Catholics Believe. And I said, yeah, what about it? And she said, well, I don't know about all this. I'm not sure what I'm getting myself into. And I asked her to elaborate, and she began asking me about various aspects of the doctrine, and she said, that sounds pretty strange, that sounds pretty weird. And I came back thinking, as opposed to, it all worked out in the end. We've been married for 10 years. But what struck me was the fact that it struck me as so odd then that she would know nothing about Catholics, until I thought about the fact that she grew up in a culture in which Christianity, while there are Christians in Israel, Christianity doesn't really have a very large impact on that culture. She knew Islam, she knew Judaism, but she had no real point of reference just because there were not that many Christians per capita in the country, and there was no real effort made to incorporate or advance the causes of Christians in the culture. And in a sense, I think there's a parallel there for where most Americans are, including myself, with Islam. There have been Muslims living in this country from the beginning. There are more Muslims living here than there were 50 years ago, 25 years ago. But I think the fact is that probably most of us don't really know Islam beyond the unfortunately unpleasant introductions that many of us have had through the news media. Katherine and I were talking about this earlier today. Where did we first become conscious, really, of Islam beyond things we might have heard about in the 4th grade? And it was 1979 with the hostage takeover. It wasn't a very favorable or positive introduction to the topic of Islam for those of us who didn't know very much about it. We have 4 people who are going to help us bridge these potential gaps in understanding. Each of them come at it in different ways, and I want to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to come back and hear each person speak for a few minutes. We'll then talk among ourselves, and then the part of the program we really want to get to is where you ask questions and join this dialogue and learn from the vast, actually, not just depth, but breadth of experience that we have here represented on this panel. To my far left is Skip Gnehm. I just want to have a round of applause. I'll be coming back with more details a little bit later. Haleh Esfandiari. John Esposito. And Shibley Telhami. I think all of these people are familiar to you. You've probably seen them on television, which is not necessarily a rank of stature, but in the case of these people it is. I think all of them have been on Nightline at one time or another. John Esposito is where I want to begin the program tonight, because he's published a book, the equivalent, I suppose, of What Catholics Believe, which is called What You Need to Know, What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam. And I found it fascinating that in the introduction to the book, John, you said that you yourself as a graduate student was astounded to learn that that there was another major Abrahamic faith called Islam. You have, since that point, educated yourself and become one of the nation's chief explainers of the topic of Islam. I'd like to introduce John Esposito, who is the founder of the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. John?
I would just begin by saying that if you want to understand can you hear me okay? If you want to understand the context in which much of this occurs.
John, do you want to take the podium for this portion of the program then?
Great. I can't think when I sit anyway, so it'll work out a lot better. If you want to understand the context in which my comments occur, when I decided to go into the field, which was very reluctantly, I didn't want to study Islam. The chairman of my department, after I had studied Hinduism and Buddhism, said I ought to take a course in Islam. Most of my friends said I wouldn't get a job, and they were very close to right. I finished in 1974. And the reality of it was there were no great positions. America discovered Islam with the Iranian Revolution. And I remember Tom Brokaw in the morning interrupting the news report to say, there's a religion called Islam, it has a prophet named Muhammad, and it has a revelation or a book called the Quran. And then he moved on. And I thought to myself, would any of us, if we traveled around the world, think that one needed to explain who Jesus or Moses or what the word Bible meant? But here we were in our kind of society. Let me make a couple of opening observations. Number one, we talk about a war against global terrorism, and we have a president who is very careful from the very beginning to distinguish between Islam and Muslim extremism. The fact is, across the Muslim world today, not among extremists, but among mainstream Muslims, the belief is that what they are seeing, for many of them, is a war against Islam in the Muslim world. And I think one needs to ask why. And I've seen this from Egypt all the way over to Southeast Asia. The day after 9/11, I had an Egyptian friend email me, and she said, it's terrible what happened. I hope you're okay and your family. Certainly you'll want to go after Osama bin Laden, but we wonder if this is the beginning or the end. And I emailed her back, and I said, what do you mean by this? And she came back and said, will this become an excuse for America to redraw the map of the Middle East and the Muslim world? For America to redraw the map of the Middle East and the Muslim world. Well, how does it seem to some folks when they look at the trajectory? The Secretary of State said we were going after Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, not to overthrow initially the Taliban. When Mullah Umar wouldn't give up Osama, we then went in and overthrew, and people understood why we went into Afghanistan. However, before that initial battle or war was over, we were already talking about second frontiers and speculation. Would it be Somalia? Would it be the Philippines? Then we had the axis of evil countries, and then we broadened that category. Then we had the president doing what no president has done, to my knowledge, having America responsible for drafting two resolutions in the UN, basically saying to Sharon to cease and desist in terms of the movement into the West Bank and Gaza. Signing off on that, and yet very shortly after that, moving towards Iraq and moving and backing away from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And in Iraq, with regard to weapons of mass destruction, when you had a North Korea, and this is what you will hear overseas, talking then about weapons of mass destruction and al-Qaeda, but then as we got closer to going in, shifting and saying this is about liberation of Iraq, democratization, and roadmap to the Middle East. The thing you learn in life is if you hold up certain criteria, people then expect you to step up and deliver on them. And I think those were two things that I don't think any American president could have actually delivered on for a variety of reasons, which made for some difficulty. I think that this becomes important. Secretary Powell gives a major speech on Islam, and he gives a major speech talking about democratization and roadmap. At the same time, many people in the Muslim world, when you're going there to speak, ask about the unholy alliance. And what do they mean? They see statements by Christian Zionists, and they see statements by neocons, and they see that however different on some issues and policies, they seem to coalesce. And they worry about what is the significance of the Christian right, for a variety of reasons. It's not just that the president's associated with the Christian right. It's that Franklin Graham, who refused to follow the president and distinguish between Islam and extremism and said Islam is evil, is the person who spoke at the inauguration and who also a year later spoke on Good Friday at the Pentagon. And so for many, they wonder about that kind of influence. On the other hand, if you look at the Muslim world today, you see those who think it's a war against Islam in the Muslim world. You see Muslim governments that use post-9/11 to crack down on any and all opposition, whether you're talking from Egypt to Uzbekistan, not just on extremist opposition, but secular or religious, mainstream or extremist. And you see those in the Muslim world that drag their feet when it actually comes to broader democratization, strengthening civil society, improving the educational system. On the other hand, what you do see in the Muslim world and in many communities today is a struggle for the soul of Islam. That is, for many Muslims who struggle to take back and to define themselves and to define out the minority of extremists who threaten them and their societies far more than they actually at times have threatened the international community if you actually look at a body count. I think all of these things come into play. And in conclusion, the final thing is, where I think the Bush administration has not gone where it needs to go and where any administration really needs to go, and indeed a couple of weeks ago Condoleezza Rice as much as acknowledge this, is that the president talked about a three-pronged approach, and it's important. The military to get and capture and punish. The economic factor. But when you get to public diplomacy, it has to go beyond public relations. It has to get into foreign policy. And although the State Department has often fronted that from time to time, we have not effectively moved on that. And so Condoleezza Rice only 3 or 4 weeks ago said that we were concerned about the perception that we had in terms of anti-Americanism overseas and addressing that. Well, you've got to address those foreign policy issues, and any next president's going to have to address it. And when it comes to public diplomacy, it doesn't help if several days after she made that statement, Mr. Bush backs away from a 3-year policy and basically goes along with Mr. Sharon increasing housing in the settlements, and within a week they announced that a visa issued to a prominent European Muslim to take up a distinguished professorship at Notre Dame, having been given, has now been pulled without giving any reasons for it. And more recently, Yusuf Islam. I can tell you, I was in Southeast Asia, and with globalization and communications, you get blindsided because people know it faster than you do because usually you're in a hotel speaking, so you're not following the news. And everybody was asking me about Yusuf Islam. And they were incredulous. you know, because they were kind of looking and saying, but look at who he is. And he's been to America 19 times. So I think that this, what we're faced with today and what any administration will be faced with is, in fact, a relationship with the Muslim world that requires, on the one hand, going after terrorists, and on the other hand, building bridges with the mainstream. And when I say mainstream, I'm talking about people that cut across society, diplomats, business people, military people, who are concerned about this relationship. Thank you.
In 1991, in Operation Desert Storm, when the United States liberated Kuwait, the man who went to the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait and raised the American flag again was the man to the far left here. Skip Gnehm is a career diplomat. He has served as ambassador to Australia, and if you're a career diplomat and they give you Australia, that's not because you're somebody's friend, that's because you're very good. He has also been ambassador to Jordan during a fairly tempestuous period, including some times of sadness. One of his colleagues, Lawrence Foley, was one of the first victims of Zarqawi, assassinated 2 years ago as he left his home. It was up to Skip to have to pick up the pieces, deal with Washington, deal with his family, and from all reports, he did it majestically. I report all this to share with you the fact that these issues are not abstract to Skip Gnehm. It is career stuff for him, it is life stuff for him, and he comes to this with a very, very unique perspective. Skip.
Thank you, John. And in the brief time for opening remarks, let me just start with September 12th, 2001. It's early in the morning, the sun is up, 7-hour difference between Amman, Jordan, and New York City. We were up most of the night before the sun really was out of the horizon. In my house came my security officer. He was very upset, very agitated. There were hundreds of people outside the gate of the embassy. He was quite concerned for security reasons, obviously, right in the aftermath hours of 9/11. They were stopping their cars in the road, getting out of their cars, bringing things in bags and things, and he wanted to know what he should do. I and a couple of others went out to kind of look from up above to see what it was. These were Jordanians who were coming to the American Embassy in Amman to express their condolences. Many were crying. Many were full of flowers. They were laying them down along the wall and the curb of the embassy. In the next 3 days, 3,800 Jordanians came to the embassy for that reason. They were ulama, sheikhs, there were women completely covered, there were children, there were doctors, there were lawyers. As John talked about, they represented every single sector of Jordanian society. And they weren't just from the capital. They had driven from the north, they'd driven from the south, hours on the highway. I start there because I want to take very quickly 3 years from that date to present and paint a brief picture, a picture that will be rather clear to you, talking about 3 subjects: the Arab-Israeli dispute, Iraq, and the aftermath of 9/11, to give you some sense of how far we've come from that rather rich experience between me and Jordanians and the Americans who were there. Peace process. There isn't a more important issue in the Middle East than the Arab-Israeli dispute to Arabs. If anybody tells you otherwise, they either don't know what they're talking about or they have another agenda. Believe you me, that Arabs want to see a solution to that dispute. When there is movement toward peace, one can feel a sense of relief. The tension and stress tends to flow out in a way that is very noticeable. When there isn't one, the stress and the tension becomes very severe. This administration, which started, frankly, saying it did not want to be involved in peace process issues because of the experience of President Clinton, actually changed its position enormously. And one of the most positive things that occurred in this period was the President's announcement in support of an independent Palestinian state. And he phrased it in terms of a 2-state solution, of 2 states, Israeli and Palestinian, living side by side in peace and security. Then came a momentous decision for the President of the United States himself to go to the Middle East. He did. He met in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt with Arab leaders, went on to Aqaba, where the king hosted Prime Minister Sharon and the Prime Minister of Palestine in what was a momentous moment. There was clearly a breath of fresh air blowing. Since then, without a roadmap that was going anywhere, with the situation in the West Bank and the territories being extremely inhumane, disastrous, with terrorism, admittedly, again raging in the streets, and victims, innocent victims, all of this effort for peace seems to have come to a collapse. The wall, the President's statement on settlements and refugees brought about an enormous reaction within the Middle East that once again America had failed to stand up to the principles that it believed in. Iraq, cataclysmic decision, without question, extremely unpopular in the Middle East. Our Arab friends, the King of Jordan, offered advice in a very friendly way. Don't go there militarily. It's a mire, it's a muck, it's a swamp. You won't believe how hard it will be to get out. Now, this was well before our military intervention. But for me, a diplomat living in the region, the issue that most troubled me in figuring out how to deal with the public perception of what we were doing came in the news. Came in the news when you turned on the television, and this could be CNN, it didn't have to be Al Jazeera, when they showed either a funeral or a group of soldiers knocking down doors, and it was Israelis in Gaza for security reasons. The next picture was uniformed military knocking down doors for security reasons, but they were Americans in Baghdad. And in the mind's eye of Arab population and of the Islamists, it was clearly that we were associated immediately in psychological and in political terms with the Israelis and what the Israelis were doing to Palestinians. After victory, which was important because people always like to associate with victory, and by that I mean military success, came the chaos of day two. I'm not going to go into it, but I'm happy to talk about it later. But in fact, as it drug out, as it got the chaos in Iraq has continued, we look more and more like the colonial and imperialist powers that the Arabs got rid of decades ago. And the way we act, the things we do, just physically, is have to take care of ourselves. I'm not making here an accusation toward our military. They're in a very difficult position. But we now are part of the problem, where we as Americans see ourselves and thought of ourselves as going there as a solution to the problem. And thirdly, 9/11 and the aftermath of 9/11, simply to say that the United States had to take serious and dramatic actions to improve the security situation. We're such an open country, an open society, there had to be some change. And invariably one of those changes had to be in our policy of admission of aliens, foreigners, and travelers here to the United States. But the impact of very stringent visa regulations and the way we treat visitors now when they arrive in the United States is to in fact humiliate and to make more difficult the very group of Arabs who are pro-American, who tend to want to have a relationship with the United States, from coming here and from continuing to have that relationship. And I would only say to you that from a government in Jordan at one point in time, about a year ago, where a majority of the ministers in government were American educated, and what a difference that makes in both the way the government looks at problems, they tend to look at them the way we'd like them to, and for me to be able to deal with the government, that won't happen if the students of today can't get a visa to come to the United States, or they fear that when they do come, they will be humiliated either at border entry or subsequently in other places. There's a feeling of humiliation, a fear of embarrassment. There's a sense of helplessness in the Arab world today coming from these issues and others, and simply making it difficult, very, very difficult for us as Americans to communicate, which is what we want to talk about tonight. Thank you.
I cheated Ambassador Gnehm of one of his credentials because you're just back from your posting in Jordan weeks ago, and you're now at the Elliott School of International Affairs, holding the Shapiro Professorship at George Washington University. We in the media, all of us tend to create a perhaps deceptive overlap between Arabs and Islam, overlooking the fact that no Arab country is the most populous Muslim country. The Muslim country with the largest population is Indonesia. Pakistan is second, not an Arab country. India is third. China, Turkey, I believe Nigeria. You can fact check me on that. Bangladesh, thank you. And Egypt is the first Arab country to show up on that list, and it appears 7th. There are 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. It's the fastest growing, it is the fastest growing religion in the world, but it's currently the second largest religion in the world. But this notion that it's about Arabs is somewhat misleading. Iran is not an Arab country, has often been mistaken for one, again, by the media or just in general discourse. Persian is spoken in Iran. Iran is not friendly with Iraq and has not been friendly at various times with other Arab countries. There is a built-in hostility that has to do with nationalism and has to do with sectarianism. I'm leading all of this up to say that we are pleased to have as our third speaker, Haleh Esfandiari, who is from Iran, first came to this country, I think you said 40 years ago, for a short visit, but has been residing here since 1980. She is the author of a book called Reconstructed Lives, Women and Iran's Islamic Revolution, and at one time was the Deputy Secretary General of the Women's Organization of Iran, is currently the Director of the Middle East Program at the Wilson Center. And what is most interesting about Haleh's contribution here tonight is, again, on the issue of women in Islam. That tends to be one of the handles with which we non-Muslims try to understand Islam and see a clear clash of values. The general assumption being that no American woman would want to live in a Muslim country because of the conception we have of what life is like for Muslim women. Haleh actually has research. She has gone to Iran and knocked on doors and talked with lawyers and doctors and professionals and has written a book about what it is really like. What are the limitations? What are the freedoms? What are the implications? I'd like to introduce once again to speak Haleh Esfandiari.
Good evening. This one, okay. I'm delighted to be here, especially since I see some familiar faces in the audience. Shall I speak loud? Okay, I'll try. I have a bit of laryngitis, but I'll do my best. If you can't hear me, just point and I'll raise my, shall I raise more my voice? Okay. Okay, is that better? Okay, good, thank you. Fine. John Esposito mentioned 1979 when the Iranian Revolution took place, and he said Tom Brokaw asked the question about Islam or explained what Islam and the Quran and Muslims are. I must confess that even for Iranians who had actively participated in the pre-revolutionary demonstrations against the previous regime, the expectation that they will end up with a theocratic system came as a surprise. You know, I mean, their aspiration, their expectation was a democratic government, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, improvement in the status of women, and they ended up with a government that tried to turn the clock back on all the progresses that were made during the previous 50 years in Iran. And that included, of course, the status of women. In the Middle East, basically, the family law, which deals with women's issues, is based on the Sharia. And it is very difficult to convince cleric to change or tamper with the Sharia. Iran, before the revolution, managed to change some part of the Sharia regarding women's law, women's rights. Women were able to vote in parliament, to get elected to parliament. They got the right of divorce. They got the right of child custody. The age of marriage was raised to 15 and then 18, and women got the right to have access to any kind of employment they wanted. After the Iranian Revolution, one of the first laws that was suspended was the family law. So the age of marriage was lowered to 9, which is puberty, and a girl can get married at the age of puberty. And it really took 25 years to negotiate over the age of puberty. And as late as a couple of months ago, the age of marriage was raised to 13. Family courts were abolished, but then reinstated under a different name. Women now can go to court and seek a divorce, but the courts are always presided by a cleric. The cleric favored the man over the woman. I'm just giving you a taste of what goes on in the region. For example, if you take the example of Saudi Arabia, I mean, I'm going to another extreme. There was hope that women could take part in the upcoming local council. But we heard yesterday that the Saudi government decided that it's too soon for women to take part in local council elections. Or in Kuwait, women were promised after the first Gulf War that they would get the right to vote. Even the Emir of Kuwait proposed this to parliament. The Kuwaiti parliament rejected it. We hope that in the next parliament, maybe women would be able to run and be elected to parliament. This was not the case in Iraq. In Iraq, there were women sitting in parliament, women ran for government offices, there were women ministers. Since the war in Iraq, we have been meeting with a number of different groups of Iraqi women, and the idea was to put in a quota of 40% participation for women in upcoming elections. A lot of negotiation when they were back and forth, and finally they got a quota of 25%. Now the big challenge for Iraqi women is how to make sure that they can fill in those 25% quota, the seats that was allocated to them in parliament. I mean, what Middle Eastern women have achieved is basically because of their own participation, because of the pressure they brought on their government, and because of the civil society activities in most of the region. I would like to say that when we talk about the region, we deal with a region where elections are rigged. Time after time, presidents are elected with 90% of the votes. Constitutions are changed to suit the son of a president to become the next president. The case of Syria after Hafez Assad suddenly died. The age of the presidency was lowered so that Bashar could fit. In Iran, reformist parliamentarians were disqualified, and the conservatives are now gaining the upper hand in Iran once again, trying to turn the clock back. I mean, it is not always the West that is at fault when it comes to the region. I think we in the region must also show an effort and a will to just advance. Thank you.
Shibley Telhami is the author of The Stakes, America and the Middle East. He is a very, very regular guest on Nightline and just about everywhere else because of the unique data that he has collected over the last few years. He's essentially designed techniques for polling in the Arab world, which requires, let's say, adjustments to the way polling is done here, because in police states people might not necessarily want to answer questions when a stranger knocks on the door with a piece of paper. But Shibley's work is highly regarded and widely reported. He has polled in Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. As Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland in College Park, he is a guy who has served all of us by going there and asking questions. Shibley?
Thank you very much. I begin with asking you to put this issue in a bit of perspective. We ask often, why do they hate us so much? And although at the beginning, the meaning of that question pertained primarily to Al-Qaeda and its allies, it is clear that in our public discourse, it has to mean they out there, meaning Muslims and Arabs broadly. And when we think about that and what the reason for it is, we often think that it's peculiar to that region. I ask you first, before we even investigate or look or think about this issue, to look at the global picture. The reality of it is, when you ask the same sort of questions, particularly pertaining to American foreign policy and issues related to Iraq and the Arab-Israeli issue, there are similar attitudes in places in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. This is not a problem that is peculiar to the Middle East as such. And I think we really have to start by making some analytical differentiations when we are looking at the Middle East. First, when you look at the Middle East as a region, not just Arab countries, but the Muslim countries, and we hear all about their economic and political problems, and they're vast. It is, in many places, a much more difficult to address these issues than in some other parts of the world. The Middle East has enormous problems that are not related to the Arab-Israeli issue, that are not related to America, that are not related to foreign policy. That issue, however, is separate from the issue of attitudes in the region toward the U.S. It is separate from why Al-Qaeda as a horrific group attacks America. And we must, therefore, differentiate those two in our minds. They're not one and the same. We get confused by shifting the tide, shifting the analysis, shifting the arguments. So let me begin with answering the question of resentment, whether, in fact, that resentment is primarily based on a principled dislike of America. And here again, I will cite you some of the polling. In 2000, when there was a viable peace process, the State Department did surveys in places like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to look at the degree of confidence in America. At that time, I remind you, there's always been criticism, particularly in the Arab world, of American foreign policy, of an American bias. That's not new to this administration. It was there even in the Clinton administration. It was there in the first Bush administration. It's always there. But what wasn't constant is the view of America and the degree of confidence they had in America. In 2000, that confidence was at over 60% in a place like Saudi Arabia. In the most recent survey I conducted early this summer, it was about 3.5%. It's in the single digit. And that's in every single country that I have polled, it's in the single digit. There has been a collapse of trust. And to be fair to this administration, much of it certainly happened after 9/11, but it began happening after the collapse of the Arab-Israeli negotiations in the fall of 2000. And it rapidly changed after the Afghanistan war. I wouldn't say after 9/11 because it was after the Afghanistan war. And so you have to ask the question, what is going on there? Well, part of it is this global picture that I suggested. But there is more, and that too you can identify in the surveys that we have been conducting. One aspect is the rising sense that America is out there to confront Muslims, that America's war on terrorism is really a war on Muslims. And by the way, that is increasingly paralleled by an American public perception, also identified in our own polling in America, that more and more people think the enemy is Muslims, not just Al-Qaeda. So we do have a problem in both places in that regard. But when you see that particular element, Donovan correctly said at the outset, the Muslim world is diverse. The Muslim world is constituted by 1.2 billion people, countries that are culturally, historically different, ethnically different, and in fact, some of them have more in conflict with each other than with the United States of America. That is absolutely true. But what is also true is over the past 3 years, there has been an increasing Islamic identity across the board that's trumping local identity, and most of it defined in relation to the United States, in countries that are not Arab and in countries that are Arab. Give you an example in Turkey. That was the country that was used as a model of the moderate Islam, the balancer of the Taliban, alternative to the Taliban model after 9/11. And to a great extent, it is. It is certainly much more democratic than most countries in the Muslim world, and it is a moderate Islamic vision that it projects. And it has certainly been an ally of the United States of America. If you look at the recent polls, you see a similar trend in Turkey and a similar trend in Indonesia and a similar trend in Pakistan. In Turkey, on the eve of the war, the majority of the public opposed the war. When you ask them why they opposed the Iraq war, certainly a large number said it was the Kurdish issue. But the number one answer they gave was that they thought that the U.S. was targeting a Muslim country. Islam, that issue was clearly trumping. And in polling that I have been doing in the Arab world, the most recent poll indicated a shift, whereas 3 years ago, you would have seen Arab identity being more important than Islamic identity. Today, Islamic identity is certainly more important than Arab identity in 4 of the 6 countries that I surveyed. People are looking at it. And my fear is twofold. One is that there is a dynamic that leaders themselves on the ground are not coming to grips with, and that we, here in America, in designing our foreign policy, despite our aim initially to separate between the bin Ladenists and the groups that must be confronted, must be fought, no other way around it, because they seek a militant order through any means. And the rest of Muslims, and I see it in a way similar to some of the early mistakes we made in relation to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In the early stages of the Cold War, if there was a mistake that was made, it was confusing nationalism with communism in a way that had blinded us to legitimate nationalism that was not aimed at America, to confuse that for communism in a way that did not allow us to notice early enough the differences between China and the Soviet Union. And in that sense, we paid a heavy price, including in Vietnam, by not seeing the difference between the two. What I'm fearful of today is that we're making a similar mistake by thinking that there is one Islamic enemy instead of differentiating between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban version and the vast majority of movements, even those who claim to do it in the name of Islam, that are strictly nationalistic. In fact, in my survey, one thing was clear. Although most opposed the U.S., when you ask them if they agreed with some of the values that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban put forth, such as women working outside the house, unthinkable in a Taliban world. 90% of Moroccans said they want women to work outside the house. 70% of Egyptians, 80% of Jordanians, 60% of Saudis. Their world is not the Taliban world. It is not Al-Qaeda's world, and we must find a way to differentiate. Thank you very much.
At this point, I was going to ask some questions, but I see that we only have an hour left, and we really would like to hear from each of you. So I'm going to... Okay. Both mics need to be picked up, or... Okay. So let's go to your questions. And I just... my role here is to be traffic cop and keep it moving along. So here are some question tips. Try to make it a question. Think question mark at the end. But I don't want to suppress the need to state a premise, because often the premise is what the question is about. But we're trying to discourage people from making speeches, which is often a tendency. Realize also that there are people behind you who would like to ask questions. So while you're sitting waiting to ask your question, challenge yourself to boil it down. And I think we'll have a more interesting and successful time. So who would like to go first? Blue shirt? Why don't you step forward? You'll need a mic? Yeah. Okay.
I always find these so-called intellectual conversations rather amusing, because they focus so much on our actions as opposed to those of the Islamic intransigence and fanaticism that we see over on the other side, even though, of course, they're in conflict with every culture that they run across. So the question that I'm always wondering is, why, in spite of the fact that there's a growing number of us, Americans and around the world, of people who's starting to see that maybe, just maybe, there might be something putrid about Islam, there is the conspicuous absence of a debate as to what Islam is, in spite of the fact that, of course, the evidence is overwhelming day by day, that basically it is the most successful cult, superstition of terrorism and conquest, jihad and all that, that the world has ever seen, that it has ever been unleashed on mankind, not to mention womankind.
Yeah. Why is there not a debate on Islam?
The case is very strong. It's posted, for example, on the website. You can just look it up. Unmasking Islam with a dash in between. Just do a Google search. Unmasking Islam. You'll get to it and you'll see it. Now, you know, there's always this...
Wait. I think that...
There's always the foregone conclusion that Islam is the religion of peace when the evidence suggests...
All right, fine. I wasn't able to hear the question, but now I can. And I'm not... I'm serious. With respect, I say that. John, why don't you take a crack at that one?
What's the question?
All right. What you're basically saying is why aren't we talking more about Islam in possibly less politically correct terms?
Yeah. I think that you're simply wrong, because I think that if you actually go to the internet that you talk about, you will see tons of websites, many of them that take the position you've just espoused, and many that take a different position. If you're dealing with websites, if you go to publications, go to Amazon.com, you will find publications by Ibn Waraq, Daniel Pipes, and you'll find publications by other people. If you look at public programs, I don't think it's quite, I would simply suggest that the empirical reality that I see says that there is a debate out there all the time. And in fact, I would even put it this way. You look at a fair number of pieces in a newspaper that get published and take out the word Islam and put in Judaism or Christianity, and no editor would even publish it. That is, people can send in editorials that just are monologues, are ideological, that's all they do is slam and provide no empirical evidence, and particularly post 9/11 is perfectly legitimate. Yet no editor, if you did a comparable thing with regard to another religious tradition, would print it. The editor would go back to the person and say, fine, you want to put this letter in here? Then provide some specific evidence.
Shibley, you'd like to jump in on this?
Excuse me, I think we need to get to a question. This isn't your forum.
You know, the one thing I think that we must think about here very carefully is, aside from lumping people together, but, you know, is Islam a religion of peace? Is this the one?
Yeah, that's it.
Is Islam a religion of peace, or is it a religion of war? Is Christianity a religion of peace or a religion of war? Is Judaism? Of course, that's a nonsensical question, because history of Christians and Jews and Muslims is full of war and peace. The Bible is full of war and peace. Every history is full of war and peace, and all of it is not connected to the notion of faith. Religion has been used for the good and for the bad historically, and Islam has historically. But in the short term, when you look at the association of Islam with violence, it is actually remarkable, because in some ways it is different from the way people posited Islam as a religion in the 1940s and 50s after World War II, when Islam was seen to be the opiate of the masses. It was interpreted even by many of the people in the West as the revolutionaries, the Arab revolutionaries, the secularists, the Marxists, thought Islam was being used to keep the status quo. It wasn't violent, it was just, I accept what God wills, and the revolutionaries went against the Islamic religion there in the name of violent change of the political order. That was an interpretation of it. When we see in Al-Qaeda as a horrific organization, not because it's a Muslim organization, but because it's a bloody, awful organization, whatever it is, whatever its religion. But when you look at the trend in the 1990s, just the previous decade, when you look at terrorism, look at our State Department numbers. When you look at where terrorism is, the Middle East did not lead in terrorism in the globe in any of the years from 1992 through 2000. It was never number one, not even number two on the list. And so we get a little confused by the focus. There are horrible people in the Middle East. There are horrible Muslims, as there are horrible Christians, as there are horrible everything. And we've got to keep that clear. That is where the debate should be. And in fact, if we go your way, we're really going down a bloody alley.
Question here.
Yes, I'd just like to focus on the future for a moment and ask the members of the panel, if you were, as a group, were appointed to whoever wins the election as a committee to suggest an exit strategy in the coming months, what would you suggest, not just militarily, but in the way of public affairs and propaganda and whatever else you might consider would get us out of Iraq and get an established peace in that country?
Skip, would you take that question? And as part of that question, I found it interesting, this question of propaganda and public affairs. Is it a question of how we're explaining ourselves, or is it a question of what we're doing?
It's a good question, and it doesn't have an easy answer. And you may not like the one you're going to get, because we're not going to get out of there with our dignity. We're going to have to eat a little bit here. We went so far, we mistook an ability that we were the superpower and omnipotent, not to understand that when you put troops on the ground in a foreign culture, that omnipotence in the air, with your rocketry and your nuclear weapons and everything else and your technology, doesn't win the hearts and minds of people. So I'm sorry, but I do have an answer to your question, and that is that I think that we indeed do have leadership in Iraq, in the interim government, that is serious, and it does have a basis. It is not able to establish itself throughout the country without any question, but we have to give it the room, these people the room to cut deals. And they will cut deals with other Iraqi groups. And my guess is that neither you nor I will like the deals. But they'll put together politically a structure for survival for themselves in office. And there will be more participation in that government than there was before. And they will come through. I'm not worried about Iraq in the long term as much as I am about the Arab-Israeli issue. But there is an exit strategy. And I happen to believe that you can go to other countries, including our European allies, that did not want to be involved before. And if there's a willingness to allow this political process to go, they will find ways of contributing to that.
Haleh, would you like to take a crack at that question? It's basically, can there be a happy ending in Iraq?
Same question. Okay. I'll go along with what Skip said, and I'll go beyond that. I think you need to call in the neighbors. I mean, you can't get peace in Iraq without having the participation of the Iranians, the Turks, the Syrians. I mean, they have to be part of the future of Iraq. And eventually, I think there is going to be a pull-out. But my impression from talking to quite a number of Iraqis is that they believe if there is an immediate pull-out, the country will just deteriorate, and there would be even the danger of a civil war. So an American presence is crucial for the next maybe year or two until the problem of security is solved. On top of the agenda for the Iraqis, when you talk to them, is first security, and then a stable government, and finally a pull-out. Thank you.
Katherine, you can choose. You can see better than I can.
In the 9/11 Commission recommendations, there's a three-pronged strategy they put forth, and can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
And one of those is to ramp up efforts in public diplomacy and wage this, quote, war of ideas. I work on Capitol Hill, and I've been struck by how Congress seemed very quick to, and the press and our political leaders seemed quick to talk about institutional reform and for military or hardware responses, and yet we seem very hesitant to tackle the more psychological and cultural manifestations of this conflict. So
You're asking, can the U.S. sell itself in the Muslim world?
Well, I'd like to hear some of the speakers' concrete ideas about concrete ways for us to engage in this, quote, war of ideas that have, I think, seem to be missing from the public.
All right, thank you. Shibley?
I served on a bipartisan commission that the administration put together last year on public diplomacy. And we wrote a series of recommendations to Congress and the administration to pursue. And when you look at that report, we started by saying most of the issue has to do with policy, but to the extent that it can go beyond policy, here's what we need to do. We have to put that in perspective. In the end, it's about policy. But if you look at the priorities, it's not only just in relation to the Middle East, but in relation to overall outreach program after the end of the Cold War. In 1980, the USIA gave out 20,000 scholarships internationally. Today, it's 900. When you look at how much we're spending in terms of outreach, reaching out to the businesses in the Middle East, reaching out to the faculty, professors, teachers, the public, NGOs, in terms of official outreach budget allocated to public diplomacy outreach programs in the entire Muslim world, 1.2 billion Muslims. It is now all of $25 million a year. We're spending over $100 million a day in Iraq today, so the priorities are clear. But one thing we have to keep in mind, it's important to build these bridges, but they're not going to address the short-term problem. The problem is bigger than just what should we do policy-wise, because we have what I call a collapse of trust. There's a collapse of faith. There's nothing we can say now that they're going to trust. Any policy we're going to do is not going to pay fruit tomorrow, because policy is going to take time. You have to buy people's patience. You have to tell them in the short term it's not going to work, but we're going to work towards something. And when you look at the surveys that I've been doing, if you want to find a single issue that is the most troubling, it's this collapse of trust. Even on issues like democracy, I happen to agree that the vast majority of people in the region want liberty. No one likes dictatorship. It doesn't matter who they are. They want freedom. They want help to free themselves from repressive regimes. When you ask them, do you believe that the United States is out there to get democracy? The vast majority of people say absolutely not. They don't believe that's what we're doing. Do you believe that's what the U.S. is trying to do in Iraq? The vast majority say no. Do you believe that there is more democracy in the Middle East today than there was before the war?
Shibley,
The vast majority say no, and that's the problem.
Let me bring John in on that same point. Can the U.S. be believed in the Muslim world at this point? If you just give that a good...
Yeah, let me say that I agree with everything Shibley just said, and it seems to me that this is really a major issue. I think one thing for us to realize is, again, to go back to something he said earlier, that a lot of the people who have a problem with America and don't trust us aren't just in the Muslim world. It's people in Europe and other places that see us as unilateral rather than multilateral, as arrogant, and therefore I think a lot of it will have to do not only with our policies, but how we formulate our policies, whether or not we form partnerships when we address the Iraqi situation successfully with people in the region, and partnerships in which we make it clear that we're not simply walking up to our partners and saying, this is the way we want to do it, and you're welcome to join us, and if you don't, we're going to do it another way. That becomes really critical, whether you're talking to Europeans or you're talking in the Arab and Muslim world. But one other specific point that I would make is that we need to step up to the plate when it comes to the funding, whether it's with regard to outreach and image, or it's regard to the infrastructure in Iraq. When people see a significant amount of money, even if our European allies don't want to step up to the plate, when they see that we're willing to put as much in as we put into military hardware in terms of rebuilding the infrastructure, because what they're going to be concerned about is security and the infrastructure, whether or not there's water, whether or not there's electricity. I mean, these are the things to keep in mind. And the final point is, remember that people who judge us, whether in the Muslim world or outside, are people, many of whom know us. And they judge us by the very principles and values that we stand for and that they admire. But they just don't feel at times that they see us applying that in their own region.
John, I like a crack. Because as I was saying earlier, what you do and what you don't do both communicate. And so the answer to your question is not always policy, but I wouldn't want to go one moment further without saying that policy is basic and solid. If a policy is bad, it communicates badly. So that's it. But if you look at something as simple, or it's not really simple, but the visa issue that I mentioned earlier, let me tell you, when I have to go to a home and the mother is crying and the father is furious, and in Jordan, the family is not 5 or 6 people, you realize it's about 50, because the cousins and the uncles and everyone else has come, because their son, who got accepted to a university in the United States and wanted to go to the United States more than anything in his whole life, couldn't get a visa. He got it 4 months later. But what that communicates to a whole group of people is that they're not wanted, there's something wrong, when in fact there isn't. And one has to think about that. And that is in the Islamic and the Muslim world that we're talking about. And so I just would simply say, we need to be more sensitive and conscious as we deal with our own problems legitimately. And we can. The president, I just will say this, the president asked the king one day in front of me, and he turned and they made me answer it, was, have we solved the visa problem? I said, I'm sorry, Mr. President, we haven't solved it at all. A son of the prime minister whose mother was killed in an automobile accident, he went home in November for the funeral and couldn't come back to school because his visa had expired. And it took 3 months. He lost all of his credit and his money. That wasn't somebody we had any doubts about, but I couldn't move a bureaucracy.
How did the president respond to your candor?
He asked me how.
I noticed you're not in Jordan.
He asked me how I would fix it.
Yeah.
And I said, simple, sir. You set up a way of giving someone a laissez-passer who could leave the United States on that and come back in with it.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you. This question is addressed to the ambassador and Mr. Esposito. In the last 2 decades, there's been a lot of carnage in the Middle East and in the Maghreb. And I'll cite just a few things. These are estimates. Between 1 and 2 million people killed in the Iran-Iraq war. 150,000 killed in the Algerian civil war. Again, as I said, these are estimates based on my readings. Between 1 and 2 million people killed in the civil war in southern Sudan excluding Darfur, where 50,000 people have died. Thousands, and I don't know the count, certainly in the Kurdish areas of Iraq. And most recently, the atrocity of 300 people dying in a massacre in Beslan. Now, I have two questions. Number one, what do these deaths have to do with the Palestinian-Israeli problem? Number one. Number two, what do they have to do with a renascent Islamic extremism?
Good question. Because as you were asking it, I was thinking of Rwanda and Cambodia and Angola and Haiti, and just as was said earlier, just a second, let me finish. The phenomenon in the developing world of these kinds of tragedies is enormous. And they are problems that are frustrated and are exacerbated by all sorts of social, political, and economic issues. There are a lot of those in the Middle East. And not all of the problems in the Middle East, by any stretch of the imagination, are a consequence of the Arab-Israeli dispute. And to those Arab friends of mine who say to me, if you would only solve it, 90% of the problems would go away, I tell them you're crazy. For the reasons that lie beneath your question. Because there are, in fact, issues that exist in the region that are exacerbated today in a way that hasn't happened in quite some time, I would tell you. And I think the next few years portend some serious, serious problems. And I think as a result of our going into Iraq, militarily, on the ground, the nation that's Christian, Western, into an Islamic society, into the heartland of the Arab world, has set in motion some factors that have in a sense been in balance for a long, long time. They're now loose. It's the Pandora box example. And there are others, but I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
I would just add, rather than go over the same ground that was said, and say that if you look at the post-Cold War period, one of the things that's interesting is that most of the conflicts are not state to state, but in fact they're ethnic and tribal. And in some areas they get joined with religion, you know, and in some areas they don't. Even if you look at the former Yugoslavia, and I just spent some time there with Serbs and Croats and Bosniaks, much of the struggle is really ethnic, historical. Then religion will.
With all due respect, sir, the deaths in the wars that I mentioned far exceed many, many times the deaths in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now,
I wasn't speaking to that.
That may be. You cited that as the source of the entire problem.
No, it's not true.
Okay, so
it's not true.
Let him address the answer.
A, it's not true, and B, if you want to see it in print, just walk out and pick up my book on Holy War. I didn't just cite that issue. There are many issues involved.
You didn't answer my question.
Haleh, would you like to join us?
Yes. Simple answer is it doesn't have anything to do with that. The number of Iranian and Iraqis who got killed in the Iran-Iraq war had nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli issue. You know, by sheer stretch of imagination, you can't even connect the two things together. Having set aside that, there is a dynamic in the Middle East. You have to take it into consideration. I mean, we now know that finally the countries in the region are trying to solve their problems without constantly falling back on that issue. But in each of these countries, there are groups. There is a political opinion who just constantly refers to the Arab-Israeli conflict, to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. If this conflict is solved, then you can finally go to these people and say, look, this is finished, this is solved, now do something, clean up your house, introduce democracy, introduce reform, introduce civil society. Unfortunately, this has become an excuse for both sides.
Next question.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Yusuf Saladin. I'm a member of the U.S. Bangladesh Advisory Council. Couple of observations, then a question. The Jewish or Israelis believe that they have a right to occupy all of Israel and all of Palestine based on what the Bible says as their promised land. We also see Christian fundamentalists like Pat Robertson who are advocating the destruction of the Dome of the Rock and replacing it with the third Jewish temple to bring on the second coming of Jesus Christ. In both cases, I mean, they're quoting from the Bible, which Muslims do not accept as the Word of God. Can this be construed to be a sort of a religious war or a religious persecution? And can the Arab-Israeli conflict and the wider conflict that we're looking around the world, is it not partly Judeo-Christian versus Islam or Muslim conflict?
First of all, I think that it's not true that most Israelis or most Jews define the conflict in the way you said, which is that they see it as a, fulfillment of the Bible in terms of boundaries. And that has shown itself. The Israeli public is divided, and clearly when there was a peace process, a majority of Israelis were willing to accept the notion of territorial compromise, which is obviously not fulfilling. So the issue of boundaries and the issue of where, there are people in Israel who think it's a fulfillment of prophecy, no doubt, and they're powerful and clearly influential in the settlement movement, but that's not the majority of the public, and that hasn't prevented the possibility of peace. And there are Muslims who don't think there should be a Jewish state in Arab land, and they see it as Arab land, no question. But when you look at what actually gave rise initially to the possibility of a settlement, why suddenly in the early 1990s there was an opening for possible compromise, territorial compromise. It was that both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, Jews and Arabs, came to define the conflict in nationalist terms. They accepted that. They accepted the notion that above all, whatever it is, they have religious beliefs, they have disagreements, they have principles, but above all, the priority for them was to have a national Jewish homeland in part of Palestine, a national Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and that opened up the possibility of territorial compromise. When you get into the religious territory, it's an endless struggle. And what is worrying me is that ever since the collapse of the Camp David negotiations in July of 2000, is that both sides have fallen into the trap of this increasingly religious and ethnic language that is redefining the conflict away from the nationalist definition that is the only way you can have a two-state solution. And if this in fact takes hold, if this in fact does become the view of the majority, then we're in for a long, long struggle.
I had the opportunity to spend the 70s and 80s in Egypt, Algeria, and most of the Arab world working for AID projects. And you could see then the AID projects were bringing infrastructure, power plants, which were really not a visible thing to the average Egyptian or Algerian. And there was a great discrepancy of wealth building. Handful, 5% of the population would be the very wealthy, no middle class, and a very impoverished country. If you look at the 1.2 billion Muslims in the world, a majority of them live in lands that have less than 10% of arable land. The few oil-making countries can survive, but it's the countries where we're generating thousands and thousands. I think in Egypt alone, there's over 50,000 students graduating from college that are not going into a business infrastructure. So the question is, how can we reallocate AID projects? When the peace treaty came for Israel and the Palestinians, Israel gets $1 billion of USAID money a year. Egypt says less than $100 million was spent in building the Palestinian infrastructure. Food, housing, economy, bills, nations, and trust. How do we get to that point?
Okay. Skip, you want to take it?
Well, you start with the fact that there isn't enough money that's allocated, and if it does go in the direction that you talked about, it's not being distributed around all the places it needs to go. In Jordan, I was actually in a good position because we have an aid program in Jordan. We have a good, healthy aid program, and we do involve ourselves in the kinds of things you're talking about. I would just add, though, that the dynamics of the economy are much broader than what an aid program can do. Obviously, it requires a government that's got a forward look, investments, providing opportunities, and the fact that Jordan joined the WTO, signed a free trade agreement with the United States, changed its intellectual property rights laws to enable American IT firms to go and operate there, actually created a lot more in the way of jobs and stimulation than what we were able to do in aid. But without the infrastructure that aid was doing, it wouldn't have happened. And I would only just add that the relationship between Jordan and Israel, in this case, is a prime example that even in the kinds of times that we're talking about today, and the difficulties that we're talking about, that relationship actually continues. And in what's called the qualified industrial zones, which is something that we set up after the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. These are zones in which companies can establish factories and export to the United States duty-free and quota-free, as long as there is an Israeli and a Jordanian content, has created 35,000 jobs, and that's still going and growing. It means that the exports of Jordan to the United States have gone from like 7 or 9 million 5 years ago to almost 100 million this year, which is dramatic. So it can be done, but it takes resources.
Thank you. In the interest of this being indeed a town meeting, I would just like to say, first of all, that I am somewhat disappointed in the short shrift that you're giving opinions expressed that concern the image of Islam, because I think it's a very real issue. And in about an hour from now, millions of Americans are going to be watching two men give very simple answers to very complex problems. And their image, sadly, unfortunately, is of a religion that does repress women, that is beheading people, that is attacking this country and killing thousands of people. So my question is, as my husband just nudged me, my question is, do moderate Muslims have a responsibility for the image of Islam that is being perpetrated in the U.S.?
That's an excellent question. John.
This may take a while. Well, I'm just going to lean into it. If you can't hear me, let me know. Extremist Muslims have a responsibility for the primary responsibility for the image. Moderate Muslims have a responsibility, that is, some moderate Muslims, I can't say all moderate Muslims, have a responsibility to the extent that some who can don't take a more visible stand. But I think there are a lot of sectors that have a responsibility. The fact is that part of what we need to do is to know about the beheadings that take place. But we also need to cover those who speak out against the beheadings. And one of the things I run into all the time is people constantly say things like, why aren't there more Muslims speaking out about this or that? And if I have the time, and I won't do this tonight because it's disastrous, I'll say things like, email me, and I'll, that invites, I have about 800 to 1,000 emails in my box on any given day. But the reality of it is you have statements that are made publicly all the time by major religious leaders, okay? Now, I'm not talking now about the extremist religious leaders, because you've got statements made by them. They're the ones that everybody loves to cover. But you have major religious leaders speaking out on a lot of these issues, major Muslim groups, calling a meeting at the National Press Club or wherever, and you don't get the same kind of media coverage. So it's not that there aren't moderate Muslims who are out there and are very concerned and who try to get the time and space to speak out on it. But they are often, A, they don't have access, and B, they're overshadowed by the fact that, the media is concerned about attention and selling newspapers. What's going to get most of your attention in selling newspapers is actually, if you can, covering the beheadings, and covering some fanatic religious cleric or, the latest Osama bin Laden statement. That's going to get most of the attention.
Let's join this and give us a sense, if you can, even if you can't do it numerically in a sort of instinctive way, weight the extremists versus the moderates. Who are there more of?
I think Thank you. I think there are many more moderates than extremists. There are fewer bin Laden and Zarqawi and all these people. There are many more moderate. And the debate goes on in the Islamic world, not necessarily here, but in the Islamic world. I mean, there is a debate even going as far as not only condemning the beheading and the extremism, but the separation of mosque and state. There are a lot of intellectuals, Muslim and non-Muslim intellectuals in the region, because you have in the region Christians and you have also Jews who live in Iran and in other Arab countries. So there is this debate going on, but we don't get to hear it here. And then going back to the visa issue, when we as organizations try to bring them, or the universities try to bring these moderates here, we are having a tough time. They make no difference between an extremist and a moderate person. So if you have to wait another 4 months or 5 months, at some stage you give up, to bring these people. But no, there is this debate, there is this condemnation, and if you look at their papers and websites, you get to see it.
The gist of the critique of the discussion in that question, though, is that a lot of what we've been talking about is what the United States has done wrong and what we need to do. But the question is really saying, what about the other side?
Absolutely.
What do they need to do?
And one of the things I became very conscious of, and I think we don't think of it in America very much, but you have to remember that bin Laden's attacks originated on attacking the Saud family and Muslims. And his accusations and attacks are on apostates, as he calls them. These are people who have compromised their faith. They've joined infidels. They've allowed the oil to be pilfered and whatever else. You can rest assured that there are large numbers of Arabs, of people in the Middle East, Islamists, who understand that their own position and their own view of Islam is under attack by a group that they don't agree with at all. The King of Jordan is one figure who's actually made speeches to the Jordanian people, but also to the Arab world, about the need to address that very issue that you're talking about, that you cannot let our religion be hijacked by those who would interpret it for their own political ends. It is out there, but it doesn't get picked up very much in the media.
I started my comments by pointing out that Muslim and Arab countries have so many political and social and economic problems that are totally unrelated to the U.S. or the Arab-Israeli conflict. Separate the two. And I think it's really helpful to separate the two, because they do, but those are not the ones that are the sources of problem with the U.S., first of all. But nonetheless, they have it. I look at it from a perspective of someone who served on a board of a human rights organization, and I look at Muslim societies, and they have a lot of things to be ashamed of as societies, not because they're Muslim, because there are huge varieties of difference. Saudi Arabia is dramatically different from Turkey, and Malaysia is dramatically different from Egypt. You have a whole host of varieties of people, of cultures, of histories. Some of them are very similar to other parts of the world. But yes, there are problems that they've got to recognize. The women issue, I think, is a clear issue that Arabs themselves recognize. That is the intellectual Arabs, as happened in a recent report. There is also the problem of minorities. I think the non-acknowledgement of what's happening in the Sudan is really awful. There are people who acknowledge, but I think overall it is not the dominant force. It ought to be the dominant force. They ought to speak out. But we are not necessarily the best agent of change. We have to remember that there's much we can do, but we're not the best agent of change. And if I may, I just want to make one point on this issue, because when you look at this question of democracy, and we say we're going to bring democracy to a place like Iraq, well, first of all, we don't have it now. And let's all hope, despite all of the security reports that say the best thing you can do is avoid maybe civil war. But let's assume we're going to have it down the road, but it isn't there now. In the meanwhile, the vast majority of people, when you ask them, they say the U.S. is not advocating democracy for good reason. Ambassador Gnehm can tell you what happened in Jordan, as happened in every other country. 90% of the people say, I don't want this war. We go to the governments just as we're trying to advocate democracy, and we say, we need your support for the war. And they say, but we got the public. Do what you have to do. You take care of your public. You come on board. What did they do to get the public to support our policies, other than additional repression? That's what the public sees. And in a way, the governments often are all too happy to not open up. In fact, Iraq today, which was supposed to be a model of inspiration, we all hope it'll become someday, but now it's a scare tool. And authoritarian governments can say, do you want this model for your country, or wouldn't you rather have the stability that I offer you? And that's scary.
Shibley, I want to bring it back to the premise of the question. Well, for you, John, on this issue of what the Muslim world needs to do.
I think that, you know, one of the things that it's hard for us to realize is that so many of the Muslim countries, not all, because as Shibley pointed out, they are diverse, basically are cultures of authoritarianism. That, you know, you have, I mean, how do most people become leaders in the Muslim world? They're not elected. They're kings, military, and ex-military. And so you have a culture of authoritarianism in which, if you look at human rights reports over the years, you've got massive, you know, human rights issues, but often, many of these countries are among our closest allies. And when you talk about media coverage, a number of years ago, one of them, that it's among our closest allies, Amnesty came out with a report called 10 Years of Torture. How much coverage did it get in the American media? Not that much. At the same time that its head of state was coming here and saying, but you have to support me because at home I'm threatened by all of these extremists. In his case, he was talking about a lot of people who were extremists, but a lot of people who weren't. And so I think that's part of the difficulty that we have. How do we support some governments that are in our short-term interest? We had the same issue in the Cold War. But long-term, we're also supporting governments that are repressive. And when you have those cultures of authoritarianism and brutality, and people aren't allowed to think, you know, freely and critically, you wind up with a very explosive situation.
I'll take on the left side.
Hi, I wanted to switch gears and ask a question about Turkey. You mentioned that it's one of the major Muslim countries and it's being considered for inclusion in the EU. I was wondering if you could give me your commentary on how Europe perceives Turkey and why it seems that Turkey has to present a very moderate, maybe not so pro-Muslim side in order to be included in the European Union. What do you think that says about Europe's view of Muslims in general?
John is just back from Turkey, and John, if you could run through the list of requirements that they set up for Turkey as well to get into the EU, that would, I mean, no, he knows.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because I've just been come back from Ankara, where I was dealing with a lot of European Union university students and Turkish university students, and then in Istanbul with basically EU, OIC, and Turks, and many are asking the same question, but from a different perspective. You know, why do they view us quite this way? And you see it in a very interesting way. Turkey was always regarded by many as this was the ideal Muslim country because it's Turkish Islam. But what they really meant was it's secularism. It's secular Islam. Okay. And in fact, the military supported that. And for many in Turkey, it's not just separation of church and state. It is a negative attitude towards religion in general. And yet the stunner was in the mid-1990s when you had an Islamist party, the Welfare Party, and its prime minister come to power, then eased out by the military. More recently, some of the people who belong to that party have now broadened it, and they no longer have an Islamist party. They don't even want to be called a Muslim party. They've opened it up to be basically an open conservative party that does recognize that most of Turkey has a Muslim culture. But still, from within Turkey as well as from within the European Union, there are those that are concerned about where does the religious issue or the religious, you know, dimension come in. And so you saw the issue, some of you reading the newspaper, on the penal law, but particularly the law that had to do with adultery. And so one of the questions that you do get, Turgut Özal, who was prime minister many years ago, said to a friend of mine after a meeting, the issue has nothing to do with meeting all of the European Union, although issues of human rights are major, and Turkey's improved the record. The issue of the Kurds was abysmal, and that's improved. He basically said, the real question is we're Muslim. And there have been some European leaders who've said, look, let's really be honest about it. We need to talk about whether or not we want to acknowledge the fact that Europe can include a Muslim country, whether that would be, if you will, a Turkey or a Bosnia. And remember also, Turkey has a very large population. So there's also that concern it would be a large constituency. But it's a very interesting situation when you look at what are the criteria
that are raised. Somebody focuses on an adultery law. Then you see that Spain is now moving towards, you have a movement towards accepting gay marriages. And then I'm thinking, gee, with the European Union, how would they deal with a president that's against gay marriages and a president that supports the death penalty, which it would be regarded by many people in Europe as unacceptable? So you've got kind of very floating criteria here, and I think a lot of it does have to do with Europe's struggle with dealing not only with the Muslims within Europe, their Muslim populations, but now dealing with the prospect of this large, quote, Muslim country coming in, or potentially coming in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years.
Carrie, go ahead.
Thanks. Just to get back to repression for a second, I'd like to, within 40 seconds, give a quick answer about why moderate Muslims aren't speaking up more, and then maybe some words of wisdom from the panelists. I think locally anyway, the Muslim moderates are not speaking up because they are being crushed under Ashcroft's boot. Let me give two examples. The Chicago Tribune reported on how the best ambassadors we really have to Pakistan, the immigrants that come over and work hard and send money home and have bought into the American dream and say, yeah, the work here is hard, but look, I'm making money and here's some money for grandma. We sent them all back to Pakistan. And not one of those people were they able to trace to any terrorism. So there were no legal actions taken against any of those men that were sent back. And then more close to home, up in Gaithersburg where I live, my neighbor has been sentenced to life in prison. Masoud Khan, and I don't know if Elizabeth Khan, his mother, is here tonight. Yes, up in the corner there. Life in prison for, as far as I can tell, playing paintball once. This is like water gun. You go out and you play paintball with other people. He played paintball once, and he's an American citizen. And my neighbor up in Gaithersburg, and he's now serving life.
With respect, you're coming up to 2 minutes, and I would like you to...
My question then is, what would you advise to moderate Muslims in our neighborhoods whose
in this country?
Whose charities and whose churches are once these legal guys hit you, your bank account is gone.
Okay,
they can't do anything.
We see the question.
This is a major issue with regard to the way in which things like secret evidence and the Patriot Act are used. On the one hand, we have to be concerned about extremism within America. On the other hand, you have a situation where thousands of people have been imprisoned since 9/11, and as of a month ago, I checked with somebody who's an expert in this area, only 9 people were found guilty of anything, and 8 of the 9 had nothing to do directly with terrorism. You have many of your major charities shut down, some of them 2 and 3 years ago. Up until this time, none have been brought forward to trial. So part of the problem many moderate Muslims have, and they come up to me after talks and say, what do I do? If I speak out, and if I do an interview, and this reporter says to me, ask me a question, and then I honestly bring up a foreign policy issue, will that get me in trouble? If I write a check for a Muslim group that speaks out, a political action committee or a charity, will that come back to haunt me? And there really, there is a real concern, and it's based on some very real examples. So I think that is an issue that we haven't faced.
We're running up against our deadline, and I'm just curious whether anyone has, in the beginning I mentioned the fact that the perception of women tends to be a handle that we have in this country on our perception of Islam. Has anybody been sitting there with a question about the status of women that they're just dying to ask? Because it hasn't come up. Yeah, Katherine.
Why do we always talk about region and the problem is the regional problem? On the issue of women especially, how can you compare, can we lump Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, even Syria? How can you lump it with Saudi Arabia? Right. And it's not comparable. Right. Let me give you, I'm an Egyptian American. In Egypt, 50%, almost 48% of the universities are women. In the government, you just stand in front of a government office at the exit time, you'll find probably more women than men. You have undersecretaries, ministers, everybody women, Supreme Court judge. So you can't lump it with Saudi Arabia. We're not, it's...
So you're wondering why we do that?
Why we always lump it? You should
Haleh, this one's for you.
Countries.
And anyone else who would like.
You are right. I mean, there has been a lot of progress regarding women's rights and women's status in the Middle East. But you can't help it. There is the family law, which is based on the Sharia, which is an impediment to women's progress in the Middle East.
That's right.
Yes, it is, but it is being changed. Of course, sure enough, I mean, it is changing, and anytime there is a small change, everybody writes about it. Nobody disputes the change. Nobody disputes that they have made a lot of progress. But there are other countries who still are tackling with this issue, and this is a big problem. You know, you don't deal with secular countries. You deal with countries where family laws are based on the Sharia. And that needs to be changed. And you talk to Egyptian women, you talk to Iraqi women, you talk to Lebanese women. No matter where you go in the Middle East, you talk to women, they want their right. They want equal right when it comes to the Sharia and the family law.
I think that Haleh is absolutely right. I think you make a very good point about the fact that, you know, if you're talking about indices of education and employment, you have to watch which countries that you compare. But the word that you should, if you're going away here and you're thinking about women and women's issues, you can think about this historically with regard to Judaism and Christianity, and you can think about it with regard to Islam today. Patriarchy, patriarchy, patriarchy. When patriarchy begins to go and disappear, because you'll find in many Muslim countries, whether the person is Islamically oriented, religiously observant or not, if they're patriarchs, and you actually look at the way in which power is distributed in the society, you know, if the boys are running the game, at the end of the day, and interpreting the religion, it's going to be an issue. And you do have women attempting to address this, whether it's reinterpreting their tradition, etc. But it's going to be a very long-term process in societies that are so dominated by patriarchy and that have authoritarian regimes again, that stifle the kind of discussion that's necessary and debate.
Shibley?
Sure. Well, I think that, you know, there is obviously a lot of diversity, as was mentioned, huge diversity, and I've been warning against lumping people together. But overall, aggregately, it's also fair to say that in the Muslim world, there is more of a gender problem than another. It might have to do more with patriarchy. There's maybe more patriarchy there, but there is a problem. And it's a problem across the board. But that should not be equated with the Taliban world. There is an absence of gender equality. There is not enough women empowerment across the board, whether it's economic, political, or social. But when you look at what societies will tolerate, again, I repeat the numbers. When I ask people, do you want women to work outside the house, 90% of Moroccans say yes. The Taliban, when they were in office, they were rejected across every single Muslim, even governments that often have to deal with them for a variety of reasons did not have relations with them, with the exception of two Arab countries actually had relations with them. So I think we have to put that in perspective. At the same time, Arabs themselves are recognizing that there is a gender problem. It has to be addressed. And I think it's not related in any shape or form to the foreign policies of these countries.
Okay.
Our time cop has shown up.
Yeah, sorry, we promised that we would stick to a strict timetable so that everyone could get out in time to go home and hear the debate, including our panelists. I just have a couple things. First, I want to thank John Donovan and our panel for really an excellent. As I said at the beginning, we entitled this Beginning the Dialogue, and it's certainly not an issue that you can finish with in an hour and a half. And so we began the dialogue tonight with your help and your support and your interest in the work of the World Affairs Council. We'd like to come back and continue the dialogue. I also want to do a few things. I want to tell you we have two special guests with us here this evening. We have three students, that have gone through the Seeds for Peace program. That brings together students from the Palestinian students, Israeli students, to discuss their perceptions of the problems that they live every day and to come together and bridge their differences. And we're happy to have them with us. We also have 2 students somewhere in the audience that are visiting Fulbright students, one from Morocco and one from Syria, and we're also very happy to have them with us. Finally, I had a little note from the League of Women Voters that on October 21st in the evening in Rockville, that there will be a debate on 3 ballot questions to be decided in the November election. I also want to tell you that the World Affairs Council, as I said, we are eager to come back to the Maryland suburbs. We do have a program planned on Iraq at the Chevy Chase Women's Club on October 25th. And we hope you'll join us. And we thank you for coming, for being a great audience, and for helping us begin the dialogue. Thank you.
Next, a debate between candidates for Missouri.